Okay. We're actually in the middle of Siman Ayin Bays, but we're starting the recordings now. So we're a couple of sifim in, and maybe one day we'll start from the beginning again. So we're talking about the halachas of Erev Shabbos, of before Shabbos, how to prepare and how to do everything in the right way. So now we're up to Siv Vav. Haminig b'chol Yisrael, there was a custom that was accepted, lefais b'batehem, that people would bake in their own homes, l'chamim l'chveit Shabbos, they would do breads for Shabbos. In other words, generally, okay, well, let's see what he means. That number one, obviously, for people that during the week they would go to a regular bakery, not a kosher bakery, there used to be that there was a very strict regulations on certain things. So bread was always two simple ingredients, or maybe three. It was flour, water, maybe yeast sometimes. In those days, probably not even. And that was it. Salt a little bit, depending on the situation. So, but they didn't add any non-kosher ingredients. Nowadays, you can't do this really, or at least not in factories and companies, because they have a whole processing and because of the volume of what they're doing. So they include different things in their processing that could definitely ruin everything. So I wouldn't suggest it now, although in European countries, sometimes they still rely on it. But there is an idea that people used to be more comfortable eating from a bakery that was a kosher bakery. Now, kosher wasn't an issue. There was another issue of eating with people that are from a different faith that you were afraid might have intermarriages and things like that. So for that, if you went to a bakery, you don't have that issue. So even those that during the week would go to a non-kosher bakery, or I should say non-Jewish bakery, so they would be careful on Shabbos not to bake it at home. Number one. And number two, sheyesh lizar lecha b'yem Shabbos kodesh pas Yisrael. There was another element that besides that they wanted to bake it in their own home, they also wanted to be careful that they're having an extra level of care of having pas Yisrael. Right? Now, what does this mean over here? What's there's two different things over here. Okay, we'll leave that for now. But one of the ideas is Kavod Shabbos. In other words, Kavod Shabbos means that you want to do things like we mentioned yesterday. You do things by yourself to show that something is honorable to you. So come Shabbos, you don't go to. Well, I mean, people do sometimes. So you need to, you have to. And nowadays it's a bit different. I'll explain it in a second. But Noah would say, you know what, just take something out of the freezer, and that's what we'll use for Shabbos. Shabbos is a whole thing. People prepare the whole time, and Challah was the same thing. There was special. They would bake bread, even if they would usually buy it for Shabbos. They would bake it. We'll see soon, kabbalistically, why. But simply, it was a way of honoring Shabbos. And number two was, besides for honoring Shabbos, it's also a higher level of kashrus. So between the two things, there was plenty of reasons why people would, for Shabbos specifically, bake bread at home, even though they wouldn't do it the rest of the week. Now, nowadays it doesn't quite work like that. For people that live in more from areas where you have a lot of kosher challah, people do buy from the store, and the place can speak about it. And they explained there's no issue. Why not? Because bread used to be bread. Sunday's bread looked like Shabbos bread. There was no difference. But at some point, it switched, and we'll talk a little bit about it later. We'll get to Lechem Mishnah, maybe, halachas. But at some point, it switched that there's special challah that you have, which is a totally different style. It's braided, and it's made differently. It looks different, So at this point, the poskim would say, if you went to a store and you're buying special bread for challah, for Shabbos, that's fine, because you're basically showing that you're honoring Shabbos also. You don't have to bake it in your house. Okay, so you do see that. But there's still an idea to bake it in your own home, as we'll see now, like this. That afilu im bechel eichlim paspalter Yisrael. Even if during the week someone was careful that they did only eat from a Yiddish bakery, which means that the levels of kashrus were very high. Nevertheless, the kavod Shabbos yefu bebeisam. Still, in honor of Shabbos, they would specifically bake in their home. Why? So he says like this: Kedei shetekayem o isha mitzvahs hafrashas challah. The reason is because we want that this special mitzvah of hafrashas challah, separating challah, which is one of the mitzvahs specifically for women, or more centered on women, I should say. So therefore, we want to fulfill that mitzvah, and that's why they would do this on bake it for Shabbos, so they should be able to do this mitzvah. Now, why is this mitzvah so important? So or I should say, why is it so important? Obviously, it's important, but why is it important on Friday? Ki Adam Arisha Nivra be'erev Shabbos. When was humankind created? When was Adam Rishon created? On Friday. He was the challah of the world. Okay, what does it mean he was the challah of the world? So there's two explanations. One of them is basically that how do you make dough? How do you make bread? You knead it. You put together flour and water and you knead it into a dough, a paste. And the same thing, a human, Hashem, when he created Adam, he took him water or whatever. He took earth and he blew and he sort of kneaded it into a body and then he blew a chayas into it. So you see a person was done in the same way. And number two, another thing also that's brought down is because this is from a sefer I think called Machzah Sheka, if I'm not mistaken, where he says that when is a dough ready to be eaten? At least in our circles, after you take challah. Before you take challah, you can't eat the dough, or at least before you designate it or whatever. So once you take challah, then it's finished. So too, Adam and Rishon, Hashem created the whole world, but until Adam and Rishon was created, the world wasn't complete. When Adam and Rishon was created, the world was complete. Either way, the point is that Adam and Rishon was considered the challah of the world. And what happened? What happened was Chava caused the Aveda to happen. She instigated, I should say rather, and therefore, through her Aveda, that challah, if you will, of the world was diminished. So she is given the ability to rectify that. Every single Shabbos, she specifically, Erev Shabbos, she'll do this mitzvah of challah, which will counter the first action that she had done that wasn't so positive, and she'll turn it around. And therefore, I'll come back to this in a second.
Nice.
I'll come back to it in a second. And therefore, therefore, the halacha is, now I love that do we do this in the way that he describes, but therefore the halacha is that people would make three challahs. Gadol, a big one, Beinani, a medium-sized one, Rakatan, and a small one. Habeinani, so that's a light. The medium one they would use for Friday night, right? People want to have a big meal, so they use the middle one. Vahagadol lesudas hayom. The big one they would use for the morning, laharis kikved hayom adif, to show that the day meal is a more important meal, like we'll come to later in the halach when we learn about that. And the hakatan, the smallest one, the suda shlishis, they would save for the third meal, so the shlishis that you have at the end of Shabbos. So they would use the small one for that. Now, just not to get too distracted, but how does it work with challah? So generally like this: there's three inyanim of challah. Number one, if it's too small, you don't do anything. You don't have to take anything. Number two, if it's big enough, you take challah and you make a bracha, and then you burn it. Yeah, you give it away. You can't give it to the kohen nowadays, so we burn it. So then there's a middle level. The middle level is when it's big enough to take challah, but not big enough to make a bracha. Okay, so how do you divide this? So in halach it'll say like 43 eggs and 2/3, something like that. So that's a little bit hard to keep track of. But the way it generally will measure is that 3 pounds and 10 ounces. Yeah, close to 4 pounds. It's like three pounds and almost 11 ounces. You separate challah with a bracha. Now, an average bag of, let's say, 5 pounds, obviously you're for sure covered. And even if it's not a full bag, you would probably still be within that category of actually taking challah and making a bracha. 2 pounds and close to 11 and 10 ounces, which is a pound less, you would separate but not make a bracha. So that's less than a half a bag. Less than half a bag, you would separate challah but not make a bracha. Okay, that's the basic idea. Keep it simple for now, but that's just for us to know as it is. Fine. Siv Zayin. Yachin basar v'dagim yafim. A person should prepare for Shabbos meat and fish. Yafim, like good ones. Umatamim, and flavorful. V'yayin meshubach, and good wine. Kefi acholtei, according to the person's ability. Why? Ki. In the Kitzur, he says ki mitzvah. He says because it's a mitzvah to eat. But the Alter Rebbe, they add in a word that's based on the Alter Rebbe, where the Alter Rebbe describes that this idea of having meat and good food on Shabbos and fish, he says it's a hidur mitzvah. Okay, so that's an important distinction. Yeah, so he says ki hidur mitzvah lecha b'chol seuda misuda Shabbos dagim. That according to the Alter Rebbe, there's a hidur mitzvah to eat fish during the meals of Shabbos. In fact, the Maggid of Mizrich used to make his own fish on Friday, apparently for Shabbos, because there was some inyan there. I'll come back to this in a second. Why we eat, where this whole thing of fish comes in. Uba siddur, the siddur means when the Alter Rebbe, we spoke about this before. He wrote the Shulchan Aruch, and later on he wrote the siddur. The siddur was the last thing. In the siddur, when the Alter Rebbe wrote little notes of halachas of before different things, so he writes by the Suda Shlishis after Mincha, the Alter Rebbe writes in the Siddur that le'inyan suda shlishis v'toiv lachol dog b'suda zu yosimim b'shar sudas. He says that if you're going to have a choice, the best time to eat fish is actually by the third meal more than the other two. That's what he says. Now, why is that? Anyone? It's an interesting thing, yeah? So there's a few different reasons for this. Number one, it's an eis ratzon. The time after Mincha, before the end of Shabbos, is an Eis Ratzin. And because it's an Eis Ratzin, so Hashem, his eyes are focused on us, yeah? And just like we know when it comes to Tashlech, like we described when we were learning the halachas of Rosh Hashanah, you go to the water and the fish's eyes are open and there's no ayin hara and all those stuff. So Shabbos is the same thing. It's a special time. Hashem's eyes are on us. So therefore, there's an inyan to eat fish, specifically whose eyes never close as well. Number two is that apparently tzaddikim, sometimes their neshama would be in a gilgul in a fish. Okay, why? I don't know. It's a Kabbalah, but the point is that you never know if you'll be able to eat a fish and make a bracha and somehow help the neshama. Why would a tzaddik be in a gilgul? No, you're not eating the tzaddik. What you're doing is you're helping the neshama be elevated by making a bracha on this fish and be able to elevate. So that's beyond my pay grade. We'll leave that for now. Then you have another thing. Okay, and this comes from the Siddur of the Arizal. The Arizal writes about why there's fish that's dafka connected to the third Seudah. And then there's also another reason that the Rebbe's grandfather Shara Kela brings, that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away. Then similar idea that it's the time of a special time at the end of Shabbos, Eis Ratzin, and therefore somehow again fish is connected to that. Okay, the point is that even though that's the case, and traditionally this always was, as we know, gefilte fish always became like a thing. We'll save that for later. We'll talk about the malachas about why gefilte fish became a thing. But the point is, fish is connected to Shabbos. People don't make gefilte fish for Tuesday. They eat gefilte fish if it's left over, and we don't make gefilte fish on Tuesday. You make gefilte fish for Shabbos. So there was something about fish that was connected to Shabbos. However, he brings over here, and the Alter Rebbe says the same, that im ina mazikin lo. This is only if the fish doesn't bother him. If a person doesn't like it, im mazikin lo. Let's say, either he's allergic to it. Certain fish, they have mercury, I don't know, whatever they have. So a person can't have it. Or a person doesn't like fish. So lo yechlan, you don't have to eat it. There's no chiyuv to have fish. There's a minig, there's a nice thing, but there's no chiyuv. And therefore, if a person doesn't appreciate it, you don't have to. Ki Shabbos lo einignitim. Shabbos was only given to have pleasure, meaning you're eating it because this is the way. Alter Rebbe writes that how do normal people have a good time, if you will, when they have good food, good drink, and they sit together, they have a suda. So a way of showing simcha is to have this. But if you don't like it, then you eating it is going to defeat the purpose. So you don't have to eat it. Masha'enkein, by the way, on Yom Tov, there is a difference that yayin and basar, there's a chiyuv that you have to eat yayin and basar. So there, it will be a little bit different. But on Shabbos, it's okay. If you don't like it, you don't have to eat it. It's okay. Fine. Now, so if you don't want to do it, Kila Shabbos oiniglitin. Shabbos was given to have delight. We're not forcing you that you have to go and you have to have this type of thing. Now, about this, I just want to say that the Rebbe and Farbrengen in the early years, he was describing to someone, there was an interaction, it sounds like this person had done something, I don't know exactly what, or something happened, but the Rebbe told him like this. The Rebbe said that when it comes to these types of, to this mitzvah of having the good wine and good meat, you don't have to be, the Chassidim, he says, whenever Mahuder, that they would dafka go and go to the meat store and buy the most expensive flesh and go to the wine store and buy the most expensive wine. As long as you had good, decent wine and decent meat, that's the mitzvah. You don't have to go and push yourself even more. That's what the Rebbe said by the Farbrengen. This is based on something the Frierdiker Rebbe once said. The Frierdiker Rebbe once said, quoting from the Alter Rebbe's brother, I believe, Reb Moshe, that Alter Rebbe's son, Reb Moshe, that he said like this. He said, when it comes to mitzvahs that have to do with eating, so even though it's a mitzvah, but chassidim are not mahader in that. It's not something you have to go and push yourself. And it's a very simple calculation. When a person sits down Friday night to eat according to the halacha, you can have the best things and it's all, for the covered Shabbos. But what happens when a person is the covered himself eating all of these things? And he comes as Kuvit Shabbos, I'm going to have this, I'm going to have that. But really, it's because he likes it. He's not doing it for Shabbos. So because it could create within the person that even though it's for Shabbos and it's a mitzvah, but it could create that he starts to appreciate this more and it starts to go down, a rabbit hole, as they say, where one thing will lead to the next. We say, you know what? Look, it's hard to, you want to have a mitzvah that you're mahader and daven ba'aveda, and you're not eating. Why are you specifically picking the best piece of flesh? That's the mitzvah. The mitzvah is that you have to honor Shabbos. There's a lot of ways to do it. So when it comes to these types of things, Chassidim were never so makbid in it. They would make sure that they were Yitzah, whatever mitzvah it was. But to say to go to get the best one, at what point do you say that you're just being a gluttonous? You're just enjoying yourself and you're blaming it on Shabbos. So it's an interesting perspective to keep in mind. But again, according to the halacha, there is an inyan to honor Shabbos in this way. It's just that you have to do this. Fine. Another thing that he mentions, which nowadays is not so common, over here he says that v'yashchis es hasakin. You should also sharpen the knives. Shezel gamkim mikved Shabbos is also in honor of Shabbos. We don't know what this means generally because our knives are made from a different material, stainless steel or other things like that, where they don't dull as quickly and they just made differently. But it used to be that they had different types of knives, and it would be hard to eat from it. So one of the ways of showing that you're preparing for a fancy meal for a guest, and that you're gonna have a big meal, and if it's gonna be a celebration, is you one of the things they would do is prepare the knives. They would sharpen the knives. It was a thing. So in this case, I actually remember I was once learning shchita from an older sheikh. So he was laughing and he was mentioning that that every once in a while his wife will bring him like all the knives in the house and say, okay, sharpen them, So there is they were an older generation. So but nowadays you don't see it as often. People don't really do this. They either send it away or they don't. They just whatever. But there definitely was a thing that sharpening the knives is a way of honoring Shabbos. You sit down to a suda and you have like a sharpened knife. It's like, oh, that's like it does the job. So it's a way of showing honor for Shabbos in this area as well. Now, another thing that you do is the yisaken es habayis. You also prepare the house. How do you prepare the house? So one of the ways that you do that is you make the beds. Now, what does it mean to make the beds? Making the beds doesn't mean like what we do is that you put your sheets in an organized way and your pillow, puffed up at the head of your bed. That's not what it means to make the beds. Making the beds used to mean that in their one bedroom little house that used to have the dining room and the bedroom and the office and everything, they would have cushions and this and that, and that's what they would sleep on. So every single night when they would sort of, tone down and get ready to go to sleep, they would have to take out the cushions and set them up and put a thing on top. And sometimes it was even from hay or whatever they used. So it was a process. So here, people would say, when you're in the middle of a celebration, you don't start now spending 20 minutes, making your beds and stuffing it and doing this and that. They would do it before Shabbos, and it was a way that on Shabbos, you're all prepared. That's really what it means. It doesn't mean, now, making your beds would be considered the part of, I guess, cleaning your house. So that's a separate thing. The same way we mentioned before, you sweep the floor and all that stuff. And yisaken es habayis, if you remember from the Amoraim. So one of those things would be to make your bed. But in those days, making beds meant like preparing that they don't have to spend the time later when they're tired and after the meal. Another thing is v'yifres mapa ala shulchan. Another thing is they put a tablecloth on the table. And some people would say that, nowadays you finish your Su'udah, making sure the tablecloth is always there and clean is also part of Shabbos. So let's say you have a whole meal and it gets dirty and now you can't sit by the table. So some would say cleaning that tablecloth, changing it or throwing out the crumbs into the garbage or whatever you're doing, that's also part of Kavod Shabbos because you have to have a tablecloth that's like, usable. Now, and number two, or also together with that, they wouldn't just put it out for the meal. They would leave it out there the whole Shabbos on the house. You come in, you go to shul. Why do you have a tablecloth on your table when you go to shul? Because having a tablecloth on the table is a way of showing that it's a Shabbos-tika house. There's something nice about it. It just makes it more, chashiv. So this is another thing that they would do as well. Some people would put out 2 tablecloths, one on top of the other, and I believe that was to remind them of the man that came in, like we said before, in 2 layers. It would have dew on top, dew on bottom. Fine. So that's already. Some people do that. Some people don't do that. What? 2 layers, 2 tablecloths. Oh. Because the man was the table. Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure that was the reason why. Okay. Now, v'yismach b'biya Shabbos. Now, another thing is you have to be happy that Shabbos came. I once heard that there's a special Yetzer Hara for Friday that goes into everyone's houses and makes everyone stressed and rushed and angry with each other because there's so much to do and everyone's rushing. So there's a special Yetzer Hara that comes for Shabbos. So here the halacha reminds you, and it says you should be happy Shabbos is coming. It's a happy day, and therefore you should look forward to it. A person should think that imagine you were getting a visitor, a guest, a very important person, right? You prepare the whole house for them with excitement. So for sure, when it comes to Shabbos, so of course the Shabbos, the queen, you have a special guest. Of course, you want to set up the house nicely with joy, etc. In some places, they would do what's called a pastida. Pastida is like a knish, like a, excuse me, like you have like let's say like we have aldera krepla, but bigger, where you have something inside and it's covered over in the bottom and the top with dough. Umulyasa also similar, and they would do this lesudas leil Shabbos for the meal. Why would they make such a dish? What's so special? Because this was to remind them of the mun. The mun, like we said before, came with tal lamata, dew on the bottom, the tal lamayla, and dew on top, and the mun was sandwiched in the middle. So you make a sandwich, dough on bottom, dough on top, and a stuffing in the middle, potatoes, meat, whatever it is. Now, one last thing. Yesh litaim. Yeah, we'll do this one. Yesh litaim ba'erev Shabbos as tafshilin shenasu l'Shabbos. There is a meaning that people have that they taste all the food that was made for Shabbos. They taste it on Friday. And this, the Alter Rebbe says in Shulchan Aruch, v'toiv litaim mikol tavshil v'tavshil. The idea over here would be to taste from everything. So this is the famous thing, maybe some of you heard of it, Toyamel, Chaim Zachu, it's from a pasuk, that if you're Toyamel, if you taste from all the food on Shabbos, before Shabbos, and this way you show that you're doing a taste test. You're showing that this is in honor of Shabbos. So Chaim Zachu, you're zeicha to a long life. Now it happens to be, and this is from the Arizal, it's a skula lalichos yamim. However, and as we said, because Chaim Zachu, fine. But, and it's so much so, by the way, that there's a whole machlekes in the poskim about the 9 days. The 9 days you don't eat meat during the week. So what happens Friday if you want to taste the chicken soup or the meat? You can't taste it. You wait till Shabbos. But some poskim would say that on that Shabbos, if it's Erev Shabbos, you're allowed to taste the flesh because Taimach Chaim Zachu. So it has a very big thing. However, the Rebbe writes that that he never saw this being done in the Frierdiker Rebbe's house. That they would no, any Friday, that they would make sure to taste all the food. So I'm not saying you can't taste food on Shabbos, but this idea of Taimach Chaim Zachu, you don't have to do. It's mashma. If the Rebbe said he didn't see it, it's mashma that it was a meaning that wasn't accepted. So that doesn't mean you can't taste it. What I'm saying is that in other places they make a whole thing about it. They take a plate and they sit down and they the covered Shabbos. They have a whole thing they do. But none of that. You don't have to do any of that. It's not. It seems to be that it wasn't. For some reason, it wasn't a minhag, even though it's from the Arizal, it's a Kabbalah. But it sounds like it wasn't something that was accepted. Okay, and we will continue then tomorrow.